Good evening, everyone. My name is David Ng, and my co-moderator here with me today is Erin Saul. And welcome to this panel, Spectrum's Queer Engagements with Borders and Belonging, presented by UBC Social Justice Institute's Graduate Student Association. I want to begin with the recognition that our work at UBC takes place on the ancestral, unceded, and stolen territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. I am currently in Culwa, Mexica, or what is now called Mexico City, which is the ancestral territory of the Nahuatl-speaking Aztec people. While we are gathering virtually today, many of us on Indigenous land across Turtle Island, we encourage everyone to think about what it means for you personally to build better relations to land and support our Indigenous peers, friends, and community members in decolonization. Today's discussion on queerness and borders could not exist without thinking about ongoing colonial and imperial violences. Our Graduate Student Association brought together our three speakers to encourage thinking about how queerness exists across various global contexts, both within and beyond borders. This topic arose for us as we had been thinking through questions of our own relationships to queer identity, colonialism, and borders, and how we can interrogate geopolitical formulations of borders and belonging. A little bit about my relationship to this topic. I am a second-generation Chinese-Canadian immigrant settler to the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. I identify as queer, I'm an artist, and I'm a fifth-year PhD student at the Social Justice Institute at UBC. Just one note of housekeeping. If there are any deaf participants, please just comment in the comment section wherever you're viewing, just so that our interpreters can know and make sure that they can do their work. So today's panel will be structured to leave time for a 30-minute Q&A period at the end, where anyone can pose a question to our panelists using the comment section. And so before we begin, we'd like to invite Simple Yan to do a territorial welcome. So welcome, Simple Yan. It's so nice to see you.
Chin Kwanman Tomiapsiam, I'm grateful to you all. I'm Simple Yan. My ancestral name is Simple Yan. I am of Musqueam Squamish ancestry, and I'm phoning in from a village called Yelchin, known today as English Bay, and it's a Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh shared territories. So I'm going to offer you two verses of our great song from Chief Joe Capilano. His ancestral name is Sa'aplak. I'm going to be very quiet because I don't want to break everyone's eardrum. So, hope, hope, chee, hey, chaya. Hope, hope, chee, hey, chaya. Oh, hey, hey, chee, hey, chaya. Hope, hope, chee, hey, chaya. Hope, hope, chee, hey, chaya. Oh, hey, hey, chee, hey, chaya. Chin Kwanman Tomiap Siam to Sequatals Chit. Yet one hot just squallow and wait Siam. Kwanman Tomi Siam to Claqua Chit not to Kamalai. A Musqueam Squamish Tsleil-Waututh Stone Chit. Kwanman Tomi Siam to one now stay up Siam. Kwanman Tomi Siam to Sioko Quachit. First of all, very grateful for each and every one of you, our respected elders, our drag queen grandmothers, drag king grandfathers, and everything on our beautiful spectrum of the pride, trans, and black flags. Honored to be part of this beautiful introduction. I am calling in from a village called Yelchin. Again, honored to see each and every one of you. Kwamantomi up siam to sioko kwachit siam to kakahana siam to instituate in wait, asking Creator God, Buddha, Yos to give us strength and guidance for what we're going to share this evening. I am two-spirited man, born and raised in Musqueam, then North Vancouver. I knew I was two-spirited at a very early age, at 3 years of age, And yeah, let's just say, it's a challenge because due to colonialism and Christianity, two-spirited history within Squamish was intendedly removed from history. And I'm here to tell you that as a two-spirited man, I'm still here and I'm rewriting that history. So, Chinquanmantomiapsium, thank you, each and every one of you, for allowing me to spend a little bit of time with you this evening. And remember, if you can't love yourself, how are you going to love someone else? Our grandmother, our great grandmother, RuPaul Charles. So, hot Christimas, those are my words. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Simplian. It was so nice to see you. Thank you so much for that welcome. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, Sempolian, for coming to do this welcome. Before I introduce our speakers, I would like to introduce myself. My name is Erin Sal, and I am a settler on the unceded land of the Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Semiahmoo Indigenous Nations. As well, I am a first-year master's student in the Department of Gender, Race, Sexuality, and Social Justice. I'm very excited about our panel tonight. So without further ado, let me now introduce our speakers. Matthew Blaise is a passionate and dedicated non-binary queer activist who has devoted their life to advocating for the rights and equality of the LGBTQ+ community and is known for an inclusive and compassionate approach. They head an innovative and passionate team at forgive me for my mispronunciation, at Obadu youth-focused queer organization, making significant impact in advancing queer education and rights in Nigeria through the medium of art, tech, and outreach. Matthew has received several awards and accolades, including the SOGIESC Activist of the Year Award in 2020 and the 2021 MTV EMA's Generation Award. Among other prestigious international media outlets and publications, they have also been featured in Vogue, Zet, ZD Foot, Out Magazine, Pink News, Time, Bloomberg, and Channel 4 News. Kama La Mackerel is also joining us, though they are a little bit late due to weather, but they will be here. So Kama is a Mauritius-Canadian multilingual writer, visual artist, performer, educator, and literary translator who believes in love, justice, and self-collective empowerment. Their practice blurs the lines between traditional artistic disciplines to create hybrid aesthetic spaces from which decolonial and queer trans vocabularies can emerge. With wholehearted engagement in ocean narratives, island sovereignty, transgender poetics, and queer trans spiritual histories, their body of work challenges colonial notions of time and space as they relate to history, power, language, subject formation, and the body. Afrin Shairaj holds an MSc in Refugee and Forced Migration Studies from the University of Oxford and a BA in Social Sciences from the Tata Institute of Social Sciences. They have previously worked on displacement in the context of climate change and disasters with the Platform on Disaster Displacement hosted by the United Nations Office for Project Services. They currently live, work, and research in India, where they are pursuing an MA in Development and Labor Studies at Jawaharlal Nehru University, while simultaneously providing remote casework support for queer asylum seekers in Turkey pursuing third country resettlement. They rely heavily on their own communities in their work, as in life, being queer, Bahajan Muslim within, across, and despite the carceral nation state. The writing has been published by Cambridge University Press and the Forced Migration Review. Thank you so much for all our panelists for joining us today. And without further ado, I think David and I will now move it on to questions.
Perfect. Hi, Kama. Perfect timing. We just read your bio. We're so glad that you could join us.
Happy to be here.
So we thought we'd kick off the panel with just an open question. So to begin, we were wondering if you could speak about some ways that your work encounters and navigates connections between borders and queerness. Maybe I'll throw this over to Afrin to kick us off, since Kama, you just jumped on. Afrin, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much for making this space and for having me on here. So, talking about borders and queerness in my work, I think of it in terms of a holistic kind of um, framework, because I think being a queer person and being a person that lives within these nation states and within these borders and beyond these borders, it becomes a very blurry line between what is work and what is life. Um, and I will just talk about a couple of those instances. Um, I work with Muslim and queer and feminist collectives and community organizations in Kerala, which is the part of India that I'm from. And the thing is that it's not a binary between, for instance, a conservative Muslim kind of collective and a queer or feminist collective. Um, and first off, it becomes a question of addressing those borders in our minds between these divisions that we're, on the one hand, taught, but also on the other hand, experience. And um, and you come across so many elders, for instance, and come across these realizations that queer Muslims, for instance, have existed forever, and that the violence of borders exists um, in that forever as well, for as long as the nation state has existed. And that's one way that you would come across borders and queerness. Another way, for instance, as you mentioned in the bio, I worked on climate change related migration and displacement, and I continue to work on that in an academic context now. And both the migration displacement kind of continuum, as well as climate change and disasters as a long-term process, as opposed to something very limited to a particular moment in time, are both constrained by as well as exist in spite of the borders, because the questions of migration, questions of queer safety when migration occurs and when there's displacement across borders, um, the questions of what queer community looks like when you are forced from your home, the questions of forging transnational communities, all of this happens within these questions of borders, especially where the part of the world that I'm from, for instance, where so many of these states criminalized things like homosexuality and queerness itself. Then if you are forced to migrate across a border, then there is the question of, are you safe there being as you are, and can you be who you are? And that is a question that is core to understanding what migration can look like and what displacement looks like, and the violence that these borders implement in our lives, in our everyday lives, as well as in questions of safety. Because if you can no longer live in the land that you were born in and the land that your ancestors have lived in, because it is no longer safe physically to be there, then is there a place where you can be physically safe if across the border you're going to be put in jail or worse? Um, I also work with queer asylum seekers in Turkey, providing some casework support. Again, my role here is very limited, in the sense that I just kind of do casework for them and help them through some of the paperwork process. And that's not my story to tell, but there is so much of that violence that you see from the borders, from having to flee from countries where you're persecuted for your gender, for your sexuality, and to seek safety, in a world that is increasingly unsafe, even in the parts of the world where it is supposedly, on paper safe. And I encounter that quite a bit. And currently, I'm doing a master's degree in development and labor studies, and questions of labor migration and development are also so sanitized and NGOized in the current context, where you kind of lose out on the liberatory potential of workers' unions, of queerness as a revolutionary experience, and go into this idea of mainstreaming and, are we inclusive of LGBTQ plus communities, whereas there is so much beyond wanting to be part of that mainstream in our lives. And that is something that is important to consider. And I'm lucky to be doing this degree at a university that recognizes some of those considerations, and I'm able to work on those navigations as well.
Great. Thank you so much, Afrin. Maybe if I could toss it over to Kama.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. First of all, like, such a delight to be sharing space with all of you. I'm sorry I came late anyway. But long, complicated Montreal snowy things. But yeah, I love this question because I think for me, when I think about borders and the relationship to queerness and how it all relates to my work, I think about borders, of course, I always think about borders as a colonial construct, right? Like borders in terms of what separates those multiple nations that were created in this sort of like post-colonial context, but also borders between cultures, borders between languages, borders between genders, borders between disciplines. And I think for me, as a multidisciplinary artist who is working at once multilingually, but also is working across multiple disciplines and multiple art forms, part of what I'm doing, I guess for me, the attraction to working as an interdisciplinary artist is this ability to cross those borders, right? Like, and I think for me, beyond geographical location, there are the multiple other locations that we occupy. And then in my work, then it's about thinking of like, how do we blur this? How do we create a space that functions outside of a colonial framework? I think there are also all the borders that live in me, like as an immigrant, as somebody who was born in Mauritius, who also comes from a history of displacement in terms of my own ancestries, and then who has moved across multiple borders and multiple lands and crossed multiple oceans, right? Like, and I think that process, however, emancipatory, joyous, and oppressive, right? Like, because it's not one thing or the other, or spaces that also occupy me, right? Like, so I think a lot of like the borders that I cross, but then the borders that cross me, and I think for me, a lot of my goal beyond just a notion of queerness, in many ways, for me, I think it's a decolonial framework that I'm interested in, of really, like, even if we think of the gender binary, really, right? Like the gender binary as being a colonial product, right? Like as being part of the European expansion that now has been naturalized in that sense. And I think for me, then, the working in between of borders, the crossing of borders, then becomes a ripe space for allowing something that I hope is anti-colonial to emerge, and that I hope, my greatest hope is that those interspaces then can also give us a framework to think of who we are and how we relate. How we relate to each other, how we relate to the territories, how we relate to the environment, but like a different way of relating is how I think about like that intersection with borders in my work.
Great. Thank you, Kama. Matthew, we're curious to hear about your work and how it encounters and navigates connections between borders and queerness.
Okay. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here, and thank you so much, Kama, for your intelligence too. And yeah, so I mean, I'll just start with how I see my own queerness, how I define my own queerness in this space, which is Nigeria. So my queerness is a simple rejection, sometimes not simple. It's a rejection of normality around me. And this normality is prescribed by the heterosexual project that we know, and also the colonial project that we visibly see around us. And so this makes it important for me as an activist to actively fight for um, the protection of people who are rejected based on these identities that are not we're not like chosen by them, and people who reject this prescription from the general society. So my duty as an activist is to uh, be in places where they can be and speak for them. It's to provide them with services that they can't normally access due to these restrictions, and it's to just like position them in a just position them at the center of like these conversations that are being had in like places, not to ignore anybody at all. And I feel like my own interaction with borders is simply started I think it started some years ago because of the necessity to look beyond what we are from within, right? And as somebody who works in Nigeria, and knowing the harmful laws that criminalizes uh, LGBTQ people here and also exposes us to violence, it's very difficult to get support from within. So my interaction with borders is to definitely build solidarity. Um, Amongst us, amongst people who have like opportunities that we don't have, and also just build that connection um, with people outside, like over the other side in these borders, right? Because when we are talking about borders, we're talking about two parties sometimes. Those on the left and those on the right, or those on the other side. So it's just like two things, right? And sometimes people just want connection, and my duty is to build that connection with people like me who have had this opportunity, who so it's yeah, sometimes it's not ever an opportunity, right? Who have had to like just leave home, flee to the other place because of protection, who have also had to endure crazy situations, right? Just because of of safety, right? And yeah. So as I said, my duty and my interaction with these borders is simply to build this connection, to build solidarity, and so far my work has been around that.
Thank you so much, everybody, for your lovely answers. So, moving on to our next question, we wanted to talk about the myriad of ways being queer beyond borders and some of how your work engages with the idea of solidarity. So, to start with, Afrin, given your community work in India at a time of rising right wing nationalism, anti queer, Islamophobia, and caste violence, could you reflect on building sites of solidarity between queer, trans, Dalit, and Muslim communities?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for that question. First off, I want to acknowledge that even though there is a greater impunity of this violence, whether on the lines of caste or whether on the lines of religion or gender or sexuality, um, this is not something new either, because this nationalist project is not something that is new. Um, this caste violence is not something that is new. It is something that predates even the British colonialism or the European colonialism in the subcontinent. And of course, right now there is like a coming together of all of these different kinds of violence and having to navigate all of that at the same time. So there is the question of it being a fight for survival, but at the same time, there is so much of um, building community within that and in spite of that. And there is queer joy to be had, Muslim joy to be had, Dalit joy to be had, Bahujan joy to be had. And that coexists with the grief and the fight for existence. And I'd like to note that I'm not a Dalit person, I'm not an Adivasi person. So Dalits are the historically marginalized castes in India. Adivasis are the indigenous peoples in India. And but I do come from a Bahujan community, which is kind of these in between castes that aren't the historically untouchable castes, but are still considered lower castes. And so, even though there are all these instances of violence, there is also instances of solidarity and coming together. Um, and whether that looks like, praying in community, whether that looks like community kitchens, um, whether that looks like coming together in spite of and across borders, for instance. And I know that this is a very small thing, but I'd like to take this example of binders, for instance, chest binders for queer people. You can't really get them in India because nobody makes good quality ones, and they're usually highly detrimental to your health if you use them regularly, the ones that are available here. But there are collectives of queer people in India coming together to kind of source those from abroad. And that means that it's much more expensive. But there are people coming together to fund that, people coming together to make sure that that's available free of cost to others in their communities. And that seems like such a trivial example, but it really brings together so many of these questions, because that initiative is run by Dalit queer people. And I am a Muslim queer person who has benefited from that. And even though we come to these questions of, which version of ourselves will be able to live through all of this, all of these different systems of oppression that we encounter. um, I think it also brings us to this idea that um, that we don't really have to choose one version of ourselves, that we are whole human beings who might be all of these different things, who might be Muslim and Dalit and Adivasi and Bahujan and queer and trans. Um, but we're also just us, and we're allowed to be whatever version of that we want to be. And I have found so much of that joy in in different groups of uh, communities, because I think I think in the beginning I was quite overwhelmed that, I was too Muslim for the queers and too queer for the Muslims, and not finding space anywhere, because I want to honor both of those parts of me. Even just talking about those two parts of me and not all of the other parts of me. Um, but I've been able to find inclusive mosques. I've been able to find collectives of young Muslims and older Muslims who believe that there's a space for me in Islam, which isn't something that I ever thought was possible before. And finding those communities has been liberatory for me personally, and it has become something of a personal goal for me as well, to make those communities for younger people like me, for others like me, for others different from me, but still seeking to honor those different parts of themselves. And I think social media has definitely become a tool in all of this, in facilitating connections, even in the face of the media crackdowns and internet shutdowns and so on and so forth that happen in this country and across the world. Um, but I think that the reason that that's able to be somewhat successful is that it is also grounded in community, and it is facilitated when um, people are actually engaged with the realities of everyday life. And yeah, so that's kind of what it looks like over here, for me at least.
Mm.
Thank you so much, Afrin, for your incredibly thoughtful answer. We all greatly appreciate it. Um, Matthew, I'm going to turn the attention to you. So, one of the things we found interesting in your work is how you are grounded in activism in Nigeria, but have moved through other spaces as well. What does meaningful solidarity look like for you across various geographic contexts your work takes you through? Are there strategies or limitations you've encountered in trying to build solidarity?
Um, Thank you so much, Erin. So I'd say meaningful solidarity for me is simply understanding and putting to good use the power that we have as a collective to make change in different spaces and in whatever time we find ourselves. And I feel like it's very, very important at this period that we come up with our various skills, with our expertise, with everything we have, just to like enrich our communities from all over the world. Um, there's this idea that a global queer movement exists, but I think I think what we have now has to be decolonized, because the idea of the global queer movement still puts like some communities under, puts them like in a place where they feel very, very inferior, and then they're like higher communities too. So my work simply is to understand that as people who are criminalized in a certain space, there are certain opportunities I do not have, there are certain access I do not have. And as Afrin said, it's very important that you work with people who have this connection, who have this access. And definitely that's what I do with my talk, with my shows, with just simply walking around, because I understand for us to build this very solid global movement, there are sacrifices that should be made and borders that should be broken. And through social media, people are breaking these borders. And I am adding to that conversation that is being had currently. And I feel like it's very, very important that these borders be crushed, because they simply divide us as queer people. And as people who are united by these shared identities and realities, there's very important need for us to collaborate and partner. And it just seems like our government doesn't want that in different places. That's why they make very crazy immigration laws, and they just make it very difficult for people to come together. So how do we break these barriers? How do we break these barriers? For me, it's through education simply. Some people are very, very ignorant to when it comes to this whole idea, when it comes to building solidarity. The universe is just what is simply around them, and sometimes it's not their faults. They don't know what is happening in the world. So how do we educate them through different mediums like social media, like just like speaking normally? So I simply do that through my organization and through my account, creating information pieces for people to see and understand what is really happening. And it's sad that you have to remind people why they should be good people, but sometimes it's just what you have to do. And I mean, one of my other strategies is through collaborations and partnerships. I feel like my life has really changed when I discovered how important it is to work with people who have like more resources. And I mean, not even having more resources, just work with people. Sometimes you can't do things on your own. And as queer people, I believe we should always come together to do things together. As Afrin said so about the binders, what we did with my organization is to collaborate with trans organizations outside Nigeria. We know we don't have these resources, right? So we collaborate to get binders, and then we distribute these binders to queer people in different parts of Nigeria, which gets them so excited. So by doing this, we are tapping into the resources of people who have, and using it to solve problems in our own context, right? And this is a very good way to, very good path to take, because there's so much resources in the world, right? There's so much resources in the world. People are hoarding so much. So how do we get the little resources that we have to solve problems within our own communities? And this is by talking to ourselves. This is by seeing beyond these borders that have been made to divide us. And also social media is very powerful in this time and age. People are using social media to create change, and social media is one strategy I've been using from day one to talk about LGBTQ issues in Nigeria and just bring much needed attention to it. And that is another way. So when it comes to the challenges of this work, is I mean, there's this exposure of yourself to violence. As somebody who lives in this place, uh, I have to always protect myself if I don't want to be wiped out completely. There are measures I have to take every day, which is draining for a human being. And yeah, that is just a lot. That is one risk involved in this organizing work, and also the fact that um yeah, sometimes a lot of people don't understand things, and as humans, it's kind of a human thing to get angry, right, when you are trying to explain things to people and they don't get it. And yeah, I mean, one of the crazy side of this is that you might just want to go crazy sometimes, and yeah, which is kind of needed. And but yeah, there are risks involved, and there are ways we can better engage ourselves. But yeah, for me, definitely solidarity is just working hand in hand with people, queer people who have the same interest as you do, to just create the much needed change that we need in our communities, and to just break down those visible and invisible barriers that exist within.
Thank you so much, Matthew, for your answer. I'm going to move on to Kama. So, Kama, within your work, you've engaged both with trans histories and histories of enslavement in Montreal, but also these longer genealogies rooted in Mauritius, through Mauritius, sorry. What solid What does solidarity look like for you across the myriad ways of being queer?
Thank you for this question. I feel almost like saying, like, what does solidarity mean for me across borders? Which, by the way, shout out to Solidarity Across Borders, which is the biggest migrant justice organization based here in Montreal. But I think, I think a lot of what brought us to this space and time, right? Like, it's not like we live. Of course, this is always contextual according to where we're living, but like we don't live, we were not born into a random world with random dynamics, right? Like all the multiple power dynamics and the multiple structures that exist have been transmitted and reinforced from generation to generation. And I think for me, there's the intersection of in many ways all my experiences and identities, my relationship to Mauritius, my relationship to the African continent, my relationship to India, because I also lived in India for 5 years before I even moved to Canada. There's the part of being queer, of being trans. And then, landing in Canada, like I knew nothing when I came here about about Indigenous histories. I didn't know I was coming to live on colonized land. Like I had no concept of this at all. Just as much as when I lived in India for 5 years, like in the beginning, I had no concept of caste as the caste system. Well, maybe a very vague, but I couldn't grasp it, right? And I think for me, in particular, once I moved here, there was a particular kind of engagement that I had no choice but to engage because I was working. I had been thinking and working and researching and creating around this idea of silence for so long, right? Like colonial silences, queer silences. What are the stories that we never heard? What are the stories that never made it to an archive? And even in my own family, what are the stories that we never talk about because of just trauma that's been transmitted from generation to generation? And in many ways, somehow, I like to say that I'm the story keeper and the storyteller of my generation, at least in my family. And I think about like, oh, what is that job, like when you get a calling in this lifetime to be both the story keeper and the storyteller. So for me, this is a huge responsibility of what are the stories that then I tell. And in thinking for this, yes, there's my relationship to my own family history. There's my relationship to trans histories, because I think, for me, there's the part of blood ancestry, of course, that I think about, but there's also the quote unquote chosen ancestries, right? Like to be able to exist the way I do, to even be able to publicly speak in this particular moment as a trans person, I can only do that because there were generations and generations of trans people who dreamt that someday maybe somebody like me would be able to take up space, right? Like, and that has happened across history. And I feel like in many ways my job now is to think of like, oh, how do I create space for the next generations? So across all of this, there are all those multiple forms of resistance, all the multiple forms of silence. One of the things that surprised me, I've worked a bit of this in a few art projects, was the slave histories in Quebec, right? Like in Montreal, the fact that like we have that idea in particular in Canada where we're like, oh, this all happened in the US and stuff like that. But actually, I was surprised, when I actually realized, oh, there were actual slaves, both Black and Indigenous, who lived on the same colonized territories where now I'm living, right? And for me, there's a question then of responsibility. Like there's a question of how in my work then, and in my life, not just in my work, right? Like how do I live up to this responsibility, to where it's, and where liberation can only be collective, right? Like liberation is not about like climbing over each other and I'm like, I'm liberated and you're not, like. And I think for me, ultimately, whether between my experience of living in Mauritius, living in India, living in Canada, in the specific francophone Quebec context, on top of that, I think the thread of colonial history is present throughout, and those multiple threads of oppression that have expressed themselves in multiple ways. And Afrin also just, like, I don't want to erase the fact, things that Afrin mentioned in terms of like pre-colonial structures, like the caste system that existed even pre-colonization, right? But like, and I think if we're thinking about liberation in any ways. It has to be collective. It demands an engagement beyond just our experiences and our identities, because I think that's how not only solidarity is built, but that's how any form of liberation can be achieved.
Great. Thank you, all of you. So we're getting close to our Q&A period. Maybe I think we'll ask one more question. And I feel like this next question has already been touched on. The question is, even as we live in a world shaped by borders, are there possibilities that you see in your own work for thinking about queer modes of belonging that negotiate, challenge, or move beyond borders? I feel like we've already been sort of thinking about this expansive and capacious definitions of these sort of themes that we've been exploring around queerness, borders, and belonging. And just for some context, at the Graduate Student Association, in our conversations, we've been discussing how borders can call to mind a range of meanings, including how people, international pressure, funding, and protest tactics can move across borders to advance queer politics, but also the limitations of global engagements with queerness, including how countries have used pinkwashing to justify strict national borders and colonial violence by projecting an image of progressive liberalism. And of course, we're also thinking about this from a Canadian context. We were curious about this question of, are there possibilities that you see in your own work for thinking about queer modes of belonging that negotiate, challenge, or move beyond borders? Does anyone have, and maybe I'll just throw this out to the three of you, if there's any, if whoever's feeling like they want to respond first.
I mean, I can go, and I'm going to keep it short. I think because when I heard that question, the first thing that came up for me is, one of the values that's very important for me, which is imagination and reimagination, right? And I think that's the thing when we live in this cis hetero patriarchal society that we're in as queer people and colonial structure, right? Like as queer people, as racialized queer people, as people who've been colonized, like in so many ways, we just have to reimagine our existence. Like we have to reimagine how we connect to each other. We have to reimagine not only how to survive, but how to thrive, right? Like, and we end up working through all sorts of cracks and, like those borders, those drawn lines, we end up like playing with them and like shifting them and molding them just as much as we molding ourselves to be able to find space in the world. And for me, like for my artistic practice, ultimately, that's really what it's about. It's about reimagining all of it. It's about telling yourself, oh, maybe this, for me, the framework is really not working, but like evaluating the framework and then seeing what can be expressed differently, what can be related differently, what can be offered differently. And differently doesn't necessarily mean new, right? Like it can also be ancestral. But for me, I think a lot of just the power of the imagination of reimagining the structures that we're in as something that's deeply powerful.
Thanks, Kama.
Perhaps I can just add on to that. I resonated so much with what Kama was saying before about liberation not being an individual project, right? That it is something that can only happen in community. And I think that queerness also offers that same kind of potential for community, because for instance, we're all here across different borders, and we're able to do this because of our times of being on the internet and being able to forge these connections across borders. And even at a very like small community level, if you're talking about a very localized community as well, there's still so much to be drawn upon from the people who came before us, but also the people who are coming after us, and the specific kind of challenges that are being posed to us because of this capitalist, cis, hetero, patriarchal, Brahmanical world that we live in. And there's been so much in the past that our ancestors have lived through that I think gives me, and I think a lot of us, the motivation to believe that we will also survive this, and that we will not just survive, but for the people who are coming um, with us, for the people who will come after us, we want to create that space where they can thrive and live their whole selves and live their whole um, lives and communities as they want to.
Okay, thanks, Afrin. Matthew?
Yeah, to just add to everything, I simply believe that we can go beyond borders as queer people if we keep building our communities beyond these visible borders and not just see ourselves restricted to a space, going beyond the space and engaging with other queer people in different spaces. Yeah, we definitely can break these borders down and build a better solidified global queer movement, because um at the moment we just like see the old as you mentioned, pink washing, how a lot of rich countries are just posing as the saviors and the champions of LGBTQ rights. Then they give money and to other like developing countries, and then they see themselves as the savior and ask them to fight over this peanuts they've given them. So we really need to go beyond all of that and check from within how our own power structures in our queer organizations actually affect our own growth and goes against our own principles as queer people. So it's checking from within the issues that we have, how we are also tapping into these problematic power structures that we are speaking against. And it also makes me think about the power of mutual aid in all of this. Since this big organizing has really, really failed us because we are falling into the same power structures, how do we save ourselves? And this is true mutual aid. This is true seeing beyond these borders that divides us and beyond what big organizations actually want us to believe as the limitation, and see beyond all of that.
Great. Thank you, Matthew. So we have a question. So we're going to kind of shift in. So we had a question that is linked to a question that we see in the comments right now. So maybe I'll just read out. It's a question around language, colonialism, queerness. So maybe I'll just read out the question from Lee. I'm curious how issues of language identity, language-based or otherwise, and borders interact with how you queer and trans as verbs in your community. How do you imagine and practice decolonizing, which is also blowing up cis heteropatriarchy in languages or the linguistic? And the question that we had is, in planning this panel, we talked about our choice of the word queer, knowing that many contexts employ different vocabularies. As an example, one of our graduate students brought up how English plays a key role in Egyptian activist work on queerness because it is the language that nonprofits use or expect. Yet there are interesting tensions that arise when translating these conversations into Arabic. So even this panel's conversation is shaped by being in English. So we wanted to ask what connections you've encountered between queerness and language within your work. How do you think languages and paradigms that we use to know ourselves as queer impact the possibilities of queer activism / artistic practice? Can you tell we're graduate students? It's like the world's longest question. So just to recap, it's a question around thinking through, I guess, hegemonic languages like colonial languages like English, thinking about decolonization, borders. Yeah.
Perhaps I could jump in. So I come from Kerala, which is in the south of India, and the language that is predominantly spoken in the region is Malayalam. And the the queer community in Kerala, for instance, largely, I don't mean to speak for everybody, but largely prefers to use the word queer as opposed to using um, Malayalam words, because the question of decolonizing language and decolonization in general in India cannot happen separate from the question of de-Brahmanizing the language. And language is also very much rooted in a kind of cis het kind framework. And this becomes a huge problem when trying to navigate these identities in Malayalam. Now, the trans communities in Kerala, for instance, have dialects and languages of their own, of our own. But in trying to engage with the mainstream, it's more helpful to use a word like queer rather than to use the Malayalam equivalents. For instance, there is this poet called Vijay Raja Mallika. I'm sorry if that's difficult to sign. Uh, um, she is the first openly transgender poet in Malayalam to have a book published by a Malayalam printing press. And she starts one of her poems saying, മലയാള ഭാഷയെ പ്രണയിച്ച നിങ്ങൾ ഞങ്ങളെ എന്തേ മറന്നുപോയി, which means you who love the language of Malayalam, why did you forget about us? And then she goes on to say, you made us the third, the sixth, the ninth. Um, and what is it in us that you see as bhinnamai, which is the word that is used for the non-male and non-female gender. And so it's just called binnalingam, which is the different, the other gender. So it's just kind of like, oh, whatever is left over or whatever is othered from our ideas of what is normal. And she asks, what is different in us? Like, what makes us different from you? And this question of othering is then so closely linked to using this language as a means to express who we are and as a means um, to collectivize on that basis. And queer is just, I think, a word with so much more liberatory potential for us. And this is also acknowledging that Malayalam is one of the languages in India which is less gendered than most other languages in India. So the South Indian languages, the Dravidian languages, tend to be less gendered than the others. Whereas, for instance, in Hindi, each word is gendered. Like inanimate objects have gender as well, which is similar to French. And it's really difficult to have a non-gendered sentence, whereas in Malayalam you can have a lot of non-gendered sentences. And that also means that the way that we experience gender is different. Because if you are somebody who thinks in Malayalam, who lives in Malayalam, then you are also somebody for whom gender is so much beyond these ideas of male and female, of man and woman, because there is so much more potential beyond that. But at the same time, if you go into the technicalities of the language, you are again the bhinnar, the other, the different, and there is no other space for you. Whereas I think queer for us offers that space. And so in Malayalam, we've kind of taken up the word queer and we write it kind of phonetically spelled out. And that's what we use, for instance, for the queer pride. So rather than call it LGBTQIA plus pride, I mean, we do use that vocabulary. We prefer to call it queer pride because queer is so much more than an umbrella term, um, so much more than just being an amalgamation of all of these identities. There is so much of a space to question within queer, and it also gives us the space to be asked, oh, what does that mean for you, because it's a new word that we're now using in Malayalam. So, there's a question from the more mainstream community as to what does that mean? Like, is it different from trans and lesbian and gay? Because those words we kind of understand. And which also gives so much more space for the queer community to then express what being queer means to us, and how there are myriad of different ways to be queer within that word. And so, yes, there is a question of the colonial and Brahminical languages that we have access to, but there's also a question of subverting that and of using that to our advantage, of using that to find solidarities and to live a life beyond what we're given, which is to, at best, live on the margins and on the fringes. And it gives us the space to fight, to be part of the center of society, and not just live on those liminalities.
Thank you, Afrin. Kama or Matthew?
Sure, I can jump in. Oh my God, I could speak about language and like for hours. So I'm going to try to keep it short and concise because there's just like so much I want to say. Because I do work multilingually, right? Like that's the base of what I do. And I'm in a context where I'm working with two colonial languages, English and French. And everything you were saying about gendered languages earlier really resonated with me. And then there's Creole, right? In Creole, which is my mother tongue in that sense, in Creole, Mauritian Creole, there is no gender, right? Like the language is not gendered. We have one gender pronoun and that's it. And I work in between and across all of this, and I also translate work, right? Like, and for me, there's something extremely potent about like translating work. It's something that I find extremely powerful, but I'm not even going to get into that because there's so much. I think one of the things that I do want to talk about though is how we center and decenter language. And like but also beyond, there's the linguistic part of like, as in orally, how we center or decenter language, but like I think there's also how we also play with language. I'm totally shamelessly pitching my book here, Zumfam. But the reason why I'm doing it is because that was, like the fact that Zumfam is kind of like the equivalent of what transgender would be in Mauritian Creole, right? And this is a book, technically speaking, published in English, published by a Montreal press in Canada. And that, for me, for example, was like a major decision as to what would be the title of the book, and for me that was so important that I'm like, this title cannot be in a colonial language because of the kind of work that I'm exploring in the book, right? Like this was just like so, and this was like for me so intentional, where I was like, I don't care if nobody understands, right? Like and it was very important for me to just shift that dynamic, right? Like as to who is in the dominant language. Of course, I'm speaking in a Canadian context, but like, when do you feel like a linguistic minority, which is always a big debate, in particular in Quebec, right? Like, and when do you not? And when do you? But a lot of times we think of linguistic minorities as, let's say, Anglophones who live in Quebec or Francophones who live in the rest of Canada. But then there's like all this multiplicity of allophones who exist within those spaces. But the other thing, the reason why I wanted to bring out the book as well, is because even like I just wanted to show like some images of like what the book looks like inside, and that was very intentional for me, just like how the word even like lens, like on the page for me was a way of moving away, like writing this way for me was a way of moving away from a linear structure. Like there's no punctuation in the entire book. I only play with space. And for me, bring it back, the way I composed this text was thinking about the text as a body, the text as performing on the page just as much as the body of the performer performs. So for me, bringing again, I go back to the blurring of the disciplines. So thinking of text not as text but text as bodies, for me, shifts the relationship to language, and allows something I don't know if I want to see something new, but something different to emerge that falls outside of the structures. So I think, yes, I could talk about hours, what are the words for hours, about what are the words that we use or don't use. But I think also there's just like, yeah, I just wanted to bring about like how we even write and play with language, whether it's digitally or in other forms, are also a way of allowing other scripts to emerge, so to speak.
Great, thank you so much, Kama. Matthew? Nope. we can move on. Oh, we can't hear you. Oh.
Yeah, we can definitely move on. I
Okay.
think, yeah, Afrin and Kama actually said a lot, and yeah,
okay.
Let's
Great.
digest that.
Great, no problem. Thanks, Matthew. Erin?
Yeah, so we're going to be moving on to the Q&A session, which David has already sort of transitioned into. So this question actually is for Matthew. So a question from Lindsay is, I have a question in relation to something Matthew shared about social media and its importance as a practical means of transcending divides and connecting with others. Seemingly in response to a lot of the mobilization that was happening online by Nigerian activists, such as yourself, the government has previously taken steps to block Twitter and other platforms. Considering additionally the path that social media platforms and other technologies have been on, from surveillance to deplatforming folks to shadow banning to effectively endorsing online abuse, what things are you thinking about in drawing on old or new different tools to continue to build solidarities, connections, and momentum with your work?
Thank you. Thank you so much for that question. And I think the answer to that is simply the work we are doing currently, trying to get into like physical spaces, building this connection beyond social media. Social media can serve as a means to build this connection, but then we really need to come together and simply uh, be physically involved in this conversation. And that is what I hope to do, because we know how terrifying it is to protest against the government that is power drunk and want to shut you down at all costs. They don't care about any means they could go to shut you and totally just put you aside. They could shut off the internet, like what we've seen in Nigeria and also other part of the world, right? And it's so insane that what we rely on in this moment is the little connection that we've established physically. So with me and my organization, we are doing a tour to just build this relationship between our communities in every part of the world. So whenever issues like this come up, we can definitely find ways to navigate these situations. So the answer is simply connecting beyond social media. Social media can serve as a means. Then you have to put in the work to reach out physically and build those connections.
Thank you so much, Matthew, for your answer. Melissa has a question for Afrin, which I'll read out. So, Afrin, as you said, we live in an increasingly unsafe world, yet we can't truly guarantee a space will be truly safe, for everyone in a context of climate change. I'm curious of thinking with a concept such as vulnerability would reveal about the nation state, or what that will reveal about the nation state.
Thanks, Melissa. I think I'll just answer this quite briefly um, because the question of vulnerability in the context of climate change has been written about so much that I could speak about it for hours on end. But the idea of vulnerability has also been kind of co-opted into the language that works for the state. and language that works for NGOs, language that works for corporations, to just use it as a buzzword. And the idea of vulnerability is so much deeper than that. And there is also this struggle um, to have that word mean what it should mean, ideally, within these contexts of living in a capitalist world, in a world that is governed by nation states and corporations and nonprofits and the whole industry that works with that. So, creating a space that is safe for everyone, I think, for me at least, what I have seen around me in collectives that work in a sense, is to be as open as possible to being wrong, that to be as open as possible to being called out and to actually making meaningful change based on criticism that's coming from within. And because none of us is the epitome of intersectionality, for instance. We're all living these intersectional identities, and creating a safe space means making space for that, with everybody else and with all the multiplicity of identity that that can bring. And so bringing that to the context of climate change is complicated because the idea of vulnerability is so sanitized in this kind of international context of working with it. But there is a lot of work that is being done to question that sanitization of the identity, the concept of vulnerability.
Thank you so much, Afrin. I'll move it on to David.
Well, I have a question for Kama. Kama, I want to hear about your work, the project the exhibit that you have going on. Who sings the? I think it's Who Sings the Queer Island Body, and the work that you were just doing in Mauritius.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to try to keep it short again. I have a new exhibit opening just this Thursday. I'm in the middle of installation right now, called Who Sings the Queer Island Body. And this is, coming from Mauritius in particular, I think over the years, I've developed a lot of work on islands in particular. And with this work, what I was really interested in, I've been working on this for many years, but the gist of it is thinking through how historically islands have been framed under a colonial framework, right? Like islands as considered as disposable space, islands as like spaces that are laboratories, that are spaces for experimentation, that are, like we're thinking like nuclear experimentations in the Bikini Atolls, for example, or the displacement of the people from Diego Garcia, so that the US could build a military base in the Indian Ocean, right? Like that kind of ways in which islands are seen as disposable. And how is that's also related to colonial mapping, right? Like, because mapping, the way we understand maps, is also a tool of knowledge production and is a colonial tool of knowledge production that says this is where islands end, but actually islands continue under the sea. It's just that the sea, right? Like we have mountains, and also, the islands continue under the sea. It's just because it hasn't been exploited in that way that we don't see them. And so I kind of look at in short of that kind of that history within that context of how islands have historically been framed. I still think of even nowadays in popular culture, like shows like Survivor, right? Like which still give you that idea that islands are spaces where civilization go meet the wild, and which Shakespeare's The Tempest was about as well, right? Like Prospero was doing white magic on the island to civilize Caliban, right? Like, so there's that trope has existed for so long. And so in this work, in Who Sings the Queer Island Body, it's about going back to the spirituality of the island, like recognizing the island as being its own body and being its own spiritual practice that within that body that you have ecological memories, ancestral memories, geological memories, right? Like there are all sorts of histories that exist there, that they have their own sovereignty just as much as the queer body. So I really draw for me a parallel between how like as trans people, like we constantly have to assert our sovereignty of our own existence, of our own bodies, and it's the same about islands, right? Like we're still struggling in a global context to like frame island sovereignty, and for me then it's about the project was really about exploring what is the spiritual relationship then between the queer body, the racialized body, and the island body, and what emerges. Again, I love interspaces, so what emerges in that space between the two. So that's what the exhibit is about. And the exhibit is there's photography, there's video work, but video work in not as like not video work you're seeing on a screen, like installation videos. There's textiles, there's salt. I have a projection on salt where like I have a video piece projection on salt, and there's a bunch of like multilingual English, French, Creole sound compositions that I made, along with like sounds that I recorded in Mauritius of the island. So all of this then kind of like creates, for me, it's again like the hybrid space is important as a way of remapping the colonial ways in which we see islands. That's the gist of what the exhibit is about.
Okay, thank you so much, Kama. What a great way to sort of wrap up these, in a way to think about reimagining, revisioning, and looking at creative processes as well, thinking about these themes of queerness, bodies, and borders. I just want to also respect our panelists' time, because we are crossing many, many different time zones, and some of us are in the middle of the night. Maybe I'll just throw it just an offer for if any of our panelists had any closing remarks that are burning that they want to say. I'll open it up just if there's any other last comments from our panelists.
Just that I'm overjoyed to have been able to share this space across borders and time and temporalities. Thank you so much.
I think, oh my God, Afrin, do you want to go before me?
No, go ahead, Matthew.
Yeah, so thank you for like providing this space. It's 4:30 a.m. here, and I'm awake. Yeah, so I really appreciate this space. And Kama, thank you so much, Afrin. Thank you so much for the intelligence. And David and Erin, thank you. And the interpreters, just thank you so much. I have to go soon because I have to sleep.
Yes, no problem. Thank you, Matthew.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Afrin, did you have some final words?
Yeah, just thank you for having me here. And Kama, like your work sounds so fascinating. I mean, all of your works sound so fascinating. And I just relate so much to the idea of, where does the island end? Even though I didn't grow up on an island, I grew up by the sea. And, no matter where I go and no matter how landlocked, I always feel connected to the sea. And just, I think that also is the way that I feel connected to queerness. And I love that all of that comes together, that, no matter where I go, it's always something that is part of me, but it's also something so much bigger than me. And just, thank you so much for having me in this space. And thanks for the lovely questions and the wonderful moderation.
Thank you so much to everyone. As David mentioned before, we just want to be respectful of everyone's time, being in a snowstorm and, Afrin waking up early and all of that. So we have to end our discussion there. And I want to thank Matthew, Afrin, and Kama for taking the time to share each of your insights on queerness, borders, and belonging. As well, thank you so much to Sempulian and our ASL interpreters. We greatly appreciate all of your hard work when we're speaking fast at times. And finally, I would love to thank my co-panelist, David, who's always incredible, as well as everyone else in the GSA who has contributed their ideas, time, and their thinking to this panel, and Elena and Yara for doing tech work behind the scenes. So thank you for joining us, and have a great rest of your evening.
Thank you. And Afrin and Kama, don't log off right away. We're just going to say bye between us. Okay. Thanks, everyone.